The girl crumpled without a sound. One moment she was standing in front of Cedar Flat's whitewashed church, her small hands clasping a scrap of cloth as if it were a begging bowl. The next, she swayed like a sapling in high wind and folded onto the hard-packed street. Reverend Garrett's broom froze mid-sweep. His voice, a moment ago sharp with rebuke, thinned to a nervous whisper. Rowan McBride reached her before anyone else moved. He dropped to one knee in the dust, his long shadow falling across the child's fragile body. 7 years of self-imposed isolation had not dulled his instincts. The girl's pulse fluttered beneath skin as pale as winter birch. She was breathing, but shallowly, like a bird too cold to move. "She's fainted," Rowan said. His voice came out low and rough, unused to speaking. "She needs water." No one answered. A few townsfolk had paused at a distance, the boarding house matron, the storekeeper, 2 miners without work. But their faces were blank with a kind of polite horror. In Cedar Flats, people minded their own business, especially since the mine played out and law felt thinner than it had in years. Charity, once a Sunday virtue, had become an inconvenience. A second girl appeared beside him, identical except for a streak of sun-lightened hair. Her eyes were too old for her small face. She crouched protectively, one arm around her sister, the other hand held out as if to ward Rowan off. Not a word passed her lips, but the warning in her gaze was clear. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. He set his canteen on the ground and backed away a step. For her. The girl hesitated. The smell of his worn leather coat, the way he moved, slow, deliberate, must have convinced her. She took the canteen, dribbled water onto her sister's lips, then tilted it for a careful sip. The fainted child stirred, blinking, then tried to rise. "No," Rowan murmured. "Easy now." But the two were already hauling each other upright, as if escape mattered more than food or rest. The conscious girl tucked a small piece of bread from her own pocket into the other's hand, and without a word they began to retreat. "You don't have to run," Rowan said, still crouched. "At least tell me your names." The darker-haired one looked back for the briefest heartbeat. Gratitude flickered in her eyes, quickly shuttered by wariness. Then both were gone, slipping between buildings like shadows that did not belong to daylight. When Rowan straightened, the crowd had melted away. Only the Reverend remained, leaning on his broom as though it might fend off ghosts. "You'll want to stay out of that," he said, eyes avoiding Rowan's. "Strays bring trouble." Rowan wiped dust from his hands but said nothing. Trouble had a way of finding him whether he sought it or not. Rowan's cabin sat 3 miles up the narrow trail that wound through pine and aspen. He had built it himself, stone by stone, timber by timber, after burying Lucy and turning his back on the world. The walls were tight against mountain winds, and the door heavy enough to keep grief locked inside. For 3 years, he had gone down to town only for coffee, flour, and mail he rarely opened. Solitude was safer than caring. But that night, as the fire hissed in the hearth, he found himself staring at the empty chair across from him. He could still see the twins' faces. Identical, unreadable, far too calm. His daughter's fevered eyes had looked at him like that once, with absolute trust right up to the moment he failed her. He rose, restless, and opened the cupboard where he kept his small store of honey. Without thinking, he packed a slice of dried meat, an apple, and half a loaf of bread into his saddlebag. Just in case. At dawn, mist clung to Cedar Flats like an old quilt. The twins were there again, standing near the blacksmith's shop. They moved in a pattern that looked more like a drill than a plea for charity, building to building, pausing in doorways, never speaking. Rowan watched from the corner of Henderson's store, his hat pulled low. When they reached the edge of town, he walked down the alley behind Murphy's saloon, set the food on an empty crate, and stepped back into the sunlight. From across the way, he saw them approach, glance round like wary deer, then snatch up the offerings and vanish. This became their ritual. Every morning he left food where they could see him place it. Every morning they retrieved it only after he'd turned away. Not once did they thank him. Not once did they speak. But each time he caught a glimpse of their faces, he saw something changing. Less pallor, more spark in the eyes. On the 7th morning, a small object rolled from one girl's pocket as she stooped to pick up the bread. She didn't notice. Rowan waited until they disappeared, then crossed the street and picked it up. It was a doll, crudely fashioned from corn husks and faded cloth strips. Someone had stitched a face with tiny, careful stitches, braided hair from frayed rope. He turned it over in his calloused hands. He had carved toys like this for Lucy once. The memory should have cut like broken glass, but instead it sent a slow warmth creeping back into his chest. He slipped the doll into his coat pocket. The next morning he followed. The girls left town as the sun touched the eastern hills, slipping into the scrub beyond the last fence line. Rowan trailed at a distance, using skills learned as a surveyor and hunter. The earth spoke to him in broken twigs and bent grass. They were careful, but not careful enough to fool him. The trail wound past abandoned claims and cabins half swallowed by weeds. At a dry creek bed he saw small stones arranged in deliberate patterns, 3 in a triangle pointing toward water, 2 stacked flat to mark a safe crossing. It was a system, sophisticated and consistent. "Smart girls," he murmured under his breath. Too smart for this to be just hunger. By the time the sun was high, he'd tracked them into a stand of blackened trees. The air smelled faintly of char, though the fire that caused it had long since burned out. Ahead rose the crumbled remains of a stone chimney, the only upright thing left of a homestead. The ground was scorched in strange patterns, as if someone had set the blaze on purpose. Rowan stepped closer. The ruin opened like a wound. A collapsed roof, a root cellar half exposed, and on a beam near the cellar, mouth a strip of cloth tied in a neat knot, the same faded material as the girls' dresses. He crouched at the edge of the cellar and peered inside. A faint rustle answered him. 2 pairs of eyes stared back from the dark, wide and bright and full of secrets. Rowan's heart kicked against his ribs. They hadn't run away after all. They had led him here. He understood, without words, that crossing this threshold would break the careful distance he had kept. It would also shatter the wall he had built around his heart. He reached into his coat, touched the corn-husked doll, and took a breath. Because some children were worth following, because some promises were meant to be broken. He stepped forward into the shadow of the burned-out house, as the twins backed deeper into the cellar like small ghosts waiting to see if a stranger would choose mercy or leave them to vanish. And in that instant, with ash crunching under his boots, Rowan McBride knew his life was about to change again. The first marker was a triangle of stones no bigger than a fist, arranged beneath a juniper bush just past the ruins. To an untrained eye, it would have looked like a child's idle creation. But Rowan McBride had read sign for most of his adult life. And this was no accident. He crouched, studying the placement. 3 flat rocks, perfectly equidistant, pointing east. A trail marker, not random, intentional. His fingers hovered above it, tracing the direction like a compass needle. The girls had made this. He stood slowly, eyes sweeping the landscape. They were hiding, that much was clear. But not just hiding. They were navigating, communicating, marking safe paths, danger spots, maybe even messages to each other. It was a system. Silent, discreet, and smart. Far too smart for children left alone by chance. Rowan followed the trail deeper into the brush. The mountain opened around him like a secret unfolding. What once seemed like wilderness now held patterns. A length of faded string tied to a low-hanging branch. A broken pine cone split in a particular way. A single upright stone placed atop a flat one. Every few hundred yards, another sign. The deeper he went, the more disturbed he became, not because he feared the forest, but because it was clear he wasn't the only one tracking. At the third marker, where two flat rocks lay side by side like train tracks, he noticed something off. A print, boot tread, full-sized, heavy heel. It didn't match his own. Rowan crouched low, fingers brushing the edge of the print where the pine needles had been disturbed. A man had passed through here recently, maybe 2 days ago, not a trapper, not a hunter. This print was different, wider foot, more pressure on the right side, limp or weight imbalance, possibly armed, possibly looking. He stood, heart thumping hard now, but not from fear, from anger, from memory. Because whoever this man was, he had followed the same signs Rowan had just discovered. He was hunting what Rowan now felt fiercely protective of. The twins. A gust of wind stirred the trees above him. The sun flickered through branches. Rowan turned his face into it, closing his eyes for a moment. He hadn't realized how quickly his solitude had become inhabited again. He had followed them out of guilt, but now he wasn't sure it was guilt anymore. It was something else. By late afternoon, Rowan found what might have once been a miner's shack. Only the stone chimney remained intact. The rest of the structure was buckled, blackened. Inside, scattered bones of rabbits and birds lay in neat piles, stripped clean. A drying rack made of branches stood in the far corner, primitive but effective. Someone had been living here. Not recently, but not long ago either. He moved slowly, scanning the debris. Near the chimney, partially buried in soot and leaves, his hand brushed something glassy. He bent down and pulled out a small brown bottle. The label had faded, but he recognized the shape. Medicine. Laudanum, or worse. Rowan turned it in his hand, noting the cork, the remnants of liquid near the bottom. Not something children should have, which meant maybe it hadn't been theirs. Or worse, it had. He tucked the bottle into his coat pocket. He didn't like what that meant. These weren't just abandoned girls. They were survivors of something far more violent. That night, back in his cabin, the forest's silence pressed in thick around the walls. Rowan lit the oil lamp and poured a cup of black coffee, but it went cold in his hand. His thoughts wouldn't settle. He pulled the corn husk doll from his coat pocket, set it gently on the table, then placed the medicine bottle beside it. 2 artifacts of lives being lived on the edge of civilization. Children marking trails like scouts, avoiding contact, sleeping in ruins, carrying medicine no child should need. And now, someone else was following them. He didn't know what the right thing was. He only knew he couldn't walk away. Rowan rose to stoke the fire, and that's when he saw it. On the shelf above the hearth, nestled between his old coffee grinder and a rusted lantern, sat a carved wooden horse. He hadn't put it there. He hadn't seen it that morning. He approached slowly, hand hovering over the figurine like it might vanish. The horse was no child's toy. It was art, real craftsmanship, smooth sanded pine, delicate details, flowing mane, arched neck, hooves carved with precision. It was identical to one he'd once made for Lucy, but this was not Lucy's. He turned it over. On the underside, carved into the base, were 2 letters. R.M., his initials. His blood ran cold. Someone had been inside his cabin. Someone who knew him. Someone who had seen the horse he'd carved for his daughter. Someone skilled enough to replicate it. And someone who wanted him to know it. His eyes swept the room. Nothing else appeared touched. The door had been locked, windows unbroken, yet somehow someone had stood where he now stood, left this message, and vanished without a trace. A warning. No, not a warning. An invitation. Rowan sat down slowly, the horse in his lap, the weight of memory pressing on his chest like a stone. Years ago, during Lucy's final illness, a man had visited their small cabin near the southern hills. A doctor, not the usual kind. A quiet man with calm eyes, calloused hands, and an odd kindness. His name had been Morrison. Dr. Raymond Morrison. He had sat with Lucy for hours when others had given up. Given Rowan advice no other physician had offered. Not all of it medical, some of it just human. He'd even commented on the rocking horse Rowan had made by hand, saying it reminded him of his own father's carving. Dr. Morrison had died a few weeks after Lucy, caught the same fever. Or so they said, but the horse on Rowan's mantle now, it had been carved by someone who remembered the original, who had studied it, who had known Lucy and known Rowan well enough to carve his initials into the base. A coincidence, not a chance. He reached into the drawer, pulled out the letter Lucy's doctor had written him after her passing. His fingers trembled as he stared at the signature. That same same flourish at the bottom of the letter. A small, distinctive curve. The exact same as on the base of the horse. The man who left this carving was the same man who'd signed that letter, which meant Dr. Morrison wasn't dead. And if he was still alive, he was tied to these girls. Suddenly, the pieces began to shift, not into place, but into motion. There was a story under the surface of all this, one no one else had bothered to see. Rowan had been following the girls, but someone else was leading him. He looked out the window at the trees, black against the moonlit sky. Someone out there had opened the door he'd sealed shut for 7 years, and Rowan McBride was about to walk through it, because some ghosts don't haunt you, they guide you, and some people you bury aren't dead at all. Rowan spent 3 mornings in Cedar Flats before he found what he needed. The clerk's office sat above Henderson's store, a dim room that smelled of old paper and lamp oil. Dust hung in the air like smoke. Patterson, the nervous little man who served as town clerk, jumped when Rowan pushed open the door. "I'm looking for records," Rowan said. "The homestead that burned out near Willow Creek." Patterson's lips thinned. "Bad business, that fire. Lost a whole family." Rowan rested his hands on the counter. Names. Jacob Morrison, his wife Sarah, and twin daughters, Patterson recited from memory. Death certificates filed last spring. Sheriff called it a chimney fire. Tragic. Rowan leaned forward. "Show me." The clerk hesitated, then pulled a heavy ledger from beneath the counter and opened it to a page marked with black ribbon. Neat lines of ink listed the Morrison family. Date of death, March 15th. Sheriff Blackwood's signature at the bottom. Dr. Raymond Morrison's name appeared too, signing off on his brother's death just before his own fever death a few weeks later, but the handwriting was wrong. Rowan stared at it, his pulse picking up. The dates didn't match what he remembered. Dr. Morrison had signed Lucy's certificate on February 28th, the last day of the epidemic. He couldn't have been alive to sign a death certificate 2 weeks later for a fire victim, unless he hadn't died at all. "Was Dr. Morrison buried here?" Rowan asked. "Closed casket," Patterson muttered. "Too far gone to view. Sheriff had him interred quick, no funeral. People thought it odd, but with so much death." Rowan closed the ledger gently. "And the land. Sold 2 months after the fire. Some lawyer out of Colorado Springs, Hartwell, buys up properties where there's been trouble." Rowan's jaw tightened. Manufactured tragedies, purchased land. He pictured the laudanum bottle, the burned house, the stone markers. "Thank you," he said quietly, and left before Patterson could ask questions. He rode out that evening as the sun bled red behind the hills. The horse picked its way up an old mining trail toward the burned homestead. Rowan's instincts told him to move fast. Someone else was moving pieces on this board, and he was already behind. When he reached the ruins, the chimney cast a long black shadow across the scorched earth. He dismounted and tied his gelding to a cottonwood, then knelt to study the cellar mouth where he'd glimpsed the twins days before. The ground had been disturbed since then. New prints, smaller ones and heavier ones. "Rowan McBride." The voice came from behind the chimney. Low, familiar. Rowan rose slowly, his hand hovering near his holster. A man stepped into view, tall but lean, his dark hair streaked with silver, his coat worn at the edges. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were the same calm grey Rowan remembered from another lifetime. "Dr. Morrison," Rowan said. "You shouldn't have come," Morrison replied. "But I knew you would." From the cellar mouth, two small faces appeared. Faith and Hope, cleaner now, their hair neatly braided. Their eyes darted between the men. Rowan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "They're alive," he murmured. "They've been alive because the world thinks they're dead," Morrison said. "And we intend to keep it that way." Rowan stepped closer. "You faked your death." "I had to." The doctor's voice cracked on the edge of exhaustion. "Jacob sent me word before they killed him. He'd uncovered something Blackwood and his investors didn't want anyone to see. When the fire came, I got the girls out. Burned the house myself to make it look final. Forged the certificates, buried an empty coffin for me. It was the only way." Rowan's stomach turned. "Blackwood killed your brother?" "He and his hired men." Morrison's face went hard. "Jacob was his deputy. He'd found evidence of a land grab. Dozens of families forced out or accidentally killed, their property transferred to shell companies. Hartwell's name appears on all the papers. The Morrison homestead sits on a silver vein richer than anything the mine ever produced." Faith's small hand clutched her uncle's sleeve. She spoke for the first time, her voice a thin thread. "They shot Papa while Mama screamed." Hope leaned against her sister, silent but trembling. Rowan felt a flash of the old pain, Lucy's last breath echoing in his memory. He swallowed hard and looked at Morrison. "Why tell me?" "Because you're the only man left I know isn't part of it," Morrison said simply. "And because I can't keep them hidden forever. We need help. We need to get this evidence to someone beyond Blackwood's reach." Rowan's brow furrowed. "What evidence?" Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a tarnished deputy's badge, its surface scratched and dented. He set it on the edge of the cellar wall. "Jacob hid everything in here. Names, dates, transfers. He knew they'd come for him." He pressed his thumb against a nearly invisible seam. The badge separated into two halves, revealing a hollow center lined with folded papers no bigger than a matchbook. Morrison handed it to Rowan. Rowan took it carefully, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. He unfolded one sheet and scanned the tiny script. Property deeds, payment records, lists of officials, Blackwood's name again and again. "This is enough to hang them all," he whispered. "If we can get it out," Morrison said. "If we don't end up dead first." A gust of wind carried the smell of smoke from the hills. The twins huddled closer to their uncle. Rowan tucked the badge back together and slipped it into his pocket, feeling the metal's cold edge against his palm. He glanced at Morrison. "You've been watching me." "I had to know if you could be trusted," the doctor admitted. "You've lost what I've lost. That makes you dangerous. But it also makes you decent." Rowan thought of the carved horse waiting on his mantle. A message, a test, an invitation. Somewhere out in the timber, a branch cracked. Morrison's head snapped up. His hand tightened on the girl's shoulders. "They've found us," he whispered. Rowan's eyes swept the tree line, muscles coiled. In his pocket, the badge pressed like a heartbeat. The evidence was real. The conspiracy was real. And now, so was the danger. "Then we'd better move," Rowan said. He didn't add what he was thinking, that once you held proof like this, there was no going back. As Morrison ushered the twins toward a hidden trail behind the chimney, Rowan felt the cold weight of the badge against his ribs and knew the hook had already set deep. Whatever happened next, He was tied to them now, and somewhere in the shadows of Cedar Flats, men with badges and clean boots were closing in. The fire burned low in Rowan's cabin, throwing restless shadows across the log walls. Rain tapped on the roof in slow, steady rhythm. Inside, 4 figures sat around the kitchen table, their faces lit by lamplight and the weight of what they were about to risk. Dr. Morrison spread a hand-drawn map across the worn tabletop. His finger hovered over the inked outline of Cedar Flats, then moved north toward a series of jagged lines labeled only with shorthand markers and caution signs. "This route is suicide," he said, his voice clipped with worry. "No," said Faith quietly. "It's the only one they won't be watching." Hope nodded beside her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They expect us to run down the stage road, or the mining trail. That's what they'd do. That's what they've planned for." Rowan studied the map in silence. Devil's Canyon. It wasn't a name folks used lightly, a remote and half-collapsed trail that twisted through narrow rock ledges, unstable slopes, and blind drop-offs. A place that flash floods had swallowed whole more than once. Morrison looked at the girls, his mouth set hard. "You've been through it?" Faith nodded. "Twice. The last time," Hope added, "we saw 2 men with rifles waiting near the pass into Evergreen. They weren't trappers." "They were looking for us," Faith finished. Morrison sank back in his chair, rubbing his face. "God help me. You girls are 10 years old." Rowan's voice broke the silence. "And smarter than most grown men I've met." He turned back to the map. Devil's Canyon skirted around the territory's main travel arteries. If they could get through it, they could reach the foot of the Rockies without ever touching the roads Blackwood's men patrolled. "We'd still have to cross 50 miles of exposed terrain," he said. "I know someone," Morrison said. "A surveyor near Red Peak. Old friend. Has ties to the marshal's office in Denver. Not political, just honest. If we make it to him, he can get us the last stretch." Rowan nodded. "Then that's our route." Morrison exhaled, long and slow. "We leave at first light." He stood, rolled up the map, and turned to stoke the fire. Rowan watched him, then glanced at the twins. "You sure you can get us through Devil's Canyon?" he asked quietly. Faith didn't answer. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a scrap of cloth. An old shirt sleeve, frayed and stained. On it, hand-drawn in charcoal, was a series of rock markings. She laid it on the table, pointing to each mark in turn. "We made our own map," Hope added, "and left signals in the canyon, rock piles, tree marks, only we understand them." Rowan met Morrison's eyes. "They've had to survive out there, alone. They're not guessing." Morrison nodded once, reluctant but no longer arguing. Rowan stood and moved toward the window. Rain streaked the glass. Beyond the cabin walls, darkness shifted through the trees like something alive. "We'll travel light," he said. "No horses through the canyon. Too risky. Just what we can carry." They all began to move, quietly gathering supplies, wrapping jerky and hardtack in cloth, filling canteens. Faith checked their mirror signals while Hope packed the hollow badge into the lining of Rowan's coat. At some point near midnight, Rowan stepped outside to check the trail. The wind had picked up, rustling the pine needles like whispers. He stood still for a long while, letting his eyes adjust. Then he saw it. A flicker. Movement. Someone in the woods, just beyond the cabin's clearing, watching. He stepped off the porch, boots quiet on the damp earth, and moved toward the trees. But the shape disappeared, swallowed by the brush and rain. Only a single boot print remained where the figure had stood. Fresh, deep, and too large to belong to any of them. He returned inside and found Morrison checking his revolver. "We've been found." Morrison didn't ask how. He just nodded. "We leave before dawn." At daybreak, the forest still held the memory of rain. The group moved fast and quiet, staying off the trail, following animal paths through underbrush. Rowan took the lead, scanning ahead. Morrison kept rear watch. The twins stayed between them, small and silent, stepping with purpose. By noon, they reached the outer ring of Devil's Canyon. The entrance was nearly invisible, just a dry wash leading into a narrow, rock-lined passage. Rowan crouched to check for fresh sign. None. Faith led the way, checking the first set of stones at the canyon mouth. They were untouched. Hope turned to Rowan. If someone follows, we'll know. They slipped inside the canyon. The walls rose around them, tall and jagged. Sunlight barely filtered through the twists. Every 100 yards, Faith pointed out a marking. A branch turned the wrong way, a pebble stack with one flat side. Rowan began to read the signs almost instinctively. It was a language of survival, and it spoke of desperation. As they pushed deeper, the canyon narrowed to a single file passage. Above them, stones shifted with the groan of old weight. Rowan paused at one stretch of ledge where the air felt wrong. Still, but charged. Flash flood came through here last spring, Faith whispered. We marked the new weak spots. Hope tugged on Rowan's sleeve, pointing to the ridge above. A glint. Metal. Through his spyglass, Rowan caught a reflection off a rifle barrel. A man. Then another. High ground. They were being shadowed. He said nothing, just nodded to Morrison, who pulled the girls close and angled them toward cover. They weren't alone. Blackwood's men had followed them, or had been waiting all along. That night they camped in a hollow beneath an overhang of rock. No fire, just bread and water. Faith pulled out a tiny cloth-wrapped bundle and placed it in Rowan's hand. Papa gave this to Uncle Raymond, she whispered, before he died. Rowan unwrapped it. A key. Opens the box with the rest of the evidence, she said. We buried it near the river past the canyon's edge. Rowan tucked it into his vest. Then we get there. Faith looked at him carefully. They're not just after us anymore. He met her eyes. I know. He hadn't meant to get involved, hadn't meant to care. But somewhere in the last few days, he'd stopped being a stranger trailing two starving girls. He was something else now. A witness, a guardian, and now a threat to men who didn't leave threats alive. As the stars emerged above the canyon, Rowan kept watch with his rifle across his knees and one eye on the dark mouth of the trail behind them. He'd thought the girls were the hunted. Now he knew. They weren't the only ones with a target on their back. The rain came just after dawn, soaking the canyon in a cold, steady sheet. The stone walls bled water in thin veins, turning the narrow paths slick and treacherous. The wind whistled low through Devil's Canyon, warning of what was coming. Rowan tightened the leather strap on his satchel and motioned to the others. We move now, slow and quiet. Watch your step. Faith and Hope nodded, hoods pulled tight around their small faces. Their movements were sure, even on the crumbling ledges. This was their ground. They had studied every slope, memorized every loose rock and sudden drop. Rowan followed close behind Faith, his boots testing each step, his rifle slung across his back. Behind them, Dr. Morrison pressed forward with grim determination. His face was pale from exhaustion, and one arm favored from a fall the day before. But he didn't complain. He couldn't afford to. Every 100 yards, Faith paused to leave a signal. A stone balanced at a precise angle, a slash of chalk on a low boulder, markers that spoke a language known only to her sister and perhaps a few others. They climbed through a split in the rock wall and emerged on a narrow shelf no wider than a wagon's axle. Below, the canyon dropped away into shadow. A wrong step meant death. Hope glanced up toward the ridge. They'll come from above, she said quietly. Rowan nodded. and they'll expect us to panic. They didn't. They kept moving, twisting through narrow passes, ducking under ledges, following the map the twins had built in their minds. But every step deeper into the canyon felt like walking into the jaws of something ancient and waiting. It wasn't long before the signs began. First, a boot print in the mud. Not theirs. Too large. Fresh. Then a piece of cloth snagged on a branch. Blackwood's men were near. Faith stopped at a sharp bend in the canyon, where the walls narrowed so tight a man would have to turn sideways to pass. She knelt and arranged 3 stones in a small triangle, then pressed a length of string into a crevice above her head. Hope looked back at Rowan. Trap signal, just in case. They moved on. The storm grew louder, echoing through the canyon with booming cracks of thunder. Then, somewhere behind them, came a sound that didn't belong to the weather. Voices. Rowan froze, his hand going to his rifle. Morrison leaned against the canyon wall, breath shallow. They're close. The voices were shouting now, organized, closing in. From the echo, Rowan could tell they were coming from 2 directions. "They've flanked us," he said. "Split their group. They want to box us in." A shot rang out. The bullet struck the wall inches from Morrison's head, showering him with rock dust. "Go," Rowan shouted. "Get to the next rise." They ran. The path pitched upward, wet and uneven. Faith reached the top first, grabbing Hope's hand and pulling her up beside her. Morrison stumbled, and Rowan caught his arm just before he slipped. They scrambled up behind the girls, breathing hard. From the ridge above, more men appeared. Blackwood's men, rifles drawn. A familiar voice barked out, sharp and cold. "That's far enough." Sheriff Blackwood stepped forward, his dark coat soaked, a rifle in his hands. Behind him stood 6 more, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. "You're done running, Doc." Morrison said nothing. His eyes flicked to the girls. His mouth moved, barely. "Run." But they didn't. Hope's hand moved to her coat pocket. Suddenly, a glint of light flashed across the canyon wall. Then another, 3 flashes, then 5, then 7. Rowan blinked. "Morse," he muttered. "Signal code." Dr. Morrison's eyes lit with recognition. "They're here." Blackwood laughed. "Don't count on miracles, Morrison." A second later, a stone the size of a wash tub came crashing down from above, striking just behind Blackwood's men. Screams echoed. Confusion followed. More rocks rained down, carefully timed, precisely aimed. From above the ridge, shapes moved, figures appearing behind outcroppings, young and fast, using the shadows. Not children. Teenagers. Mountain-born. The Anderson boys. Morrison whispered. Faith and Hope were already moving, guiding Rowan and the doctor down a hidden trail behind the ridge, using the chaos as cover. Rowan looked back once and saw Blackwood shouting, trying to rally his men as another boulder cracked into the ledge beneath them. Not all traps need firepower. Some only need gravity and planning. As they vanished into the shadows of a side trail, Rowan glanced at Faith. She didn't look back, just moved forward, her sister at her side, her eyes clear. These girls weren't just survivors. They were fighters, and tonight the canyon belonged to them. They reached the valley floor by nightfall, feet blistered, clothes soaked, but alive. The storm had passed, leaving the earth slick and the sky broken into stars. The twins led them through a dry riverbed toward a narrow shack nestled against a rock face, so well hidden it seemed to disappear into the land itself. A man waited there, rifle balanced across his lap, weather-beaten face unmoved. It was Caleb Anderson. Rowan remembered him faintly from years past. A trapper turned recluse after losing his family in a mining collapse no one ever investigated. Folks had called him half-wild. Turns out, he'd just stopped trusting people. And yet, here he was, waiting with a pot of hot beans and bandages already laid out. He looked at Rowan without blinking. Girls said you were worth saving. Jury's still out. Rowan nodded once. Appreciate the beans all the same. Over the next 2 days, others emerged. From pine-thick ridges and highland clearings, they came in ones and twos. A widowed midwife, a former ranch hand, missing 2 fingers, an old Lakota tracker named Elias, who moved like he was part of the land. They didn't come with speeches or flags. They came with truth. Each had a piece of the puzzle, names of those disappeared after refusing to sell land. Strange deaths ruled accidental. Property deeds suddenly changed hands with forged signatures. A pattern long suspected, now proven through what Jacob Morrison died to collect. Rowan gathered each testimony, copied every name, date, locations into the leather notebook he carried now, like a weapon. "This goes straight to Marshal Thomas in Denver," he told Morrison one evening. "He's the one you mentioned, right?" Morrison nodded. The only lawman left who doesn't bend with the wind. Rowan rode to the telegraph station near Elk Fork that night, under cover of darkness. The operator, a half-blind veteran named Lester, agreed to send the coded message Rowan dictated himself. Urgent, eyes on Cedar Flats, land fraud, murder, names in hand. Contact Thomas, will deliver in person. The reply came 5 hours later. Keep the documents safe, meet contact in person, no trust in town channels. Be warned, you're not invisible. By dawn, Rowan was back at the shack. Morrison was working on a coded packet for delivery. The girls were boiling river water with the focus of soldiers. They hadn't asked for praise, just purpose. Rowan bent beside Hope, who was retying the oilskin around the badge. "You slept last night?" he asked. She nodded, not looking up. "A little." "Faith?" "She's over the ridge. Found something." He stood fast. He found Faith kneeling beneath a fir tree, clutching a wet scrap of paper in her trembling hands. "I wasn't looking for it," she said. "It was folded under a rock with a marker. I thought it was one of ours." Rowan took the page gently. It wasn't old. Fresh ink. Clean fold. At the top, a header, confidential, Hartwell Group below it, a list of names. He scanned the first few lines. John Elders, target confirmed Abigail Wells. To be relocated, Elias Gray, watchlist River Garrett. Compromised. Resolve. His stomach twisted. Each name was someone they'd seen or spoken to. The midwife, the trapper, the reverend who had turned away from the girls that day in town. Further down, his own name. Rowan McBride. Observation priority. Isolated. Remove if activated. He clenched the page so tight the ink smeared. Faith pointed to the last section. "Cedar Flats? It's on the schedule." "What schedule?" he asked, but he already knew. Her voice cracked. "They're going to wipe the whole town." The paper slipped from his hand as thunder rolled across the far hills again, distant but building. Rowan looked west, toward Cedar Flats. The enemy wasn't just trying to bury the past. They were planning to erase the rest, and they were nearly out of time. The air was thin and tense, like the pause before a lightning strike. Rowan stood with one hand resting on the saddle horn, the leather satchel containing Jacob's badge and documents strapped tight across his chest. Faith and Hope sat silently on a log nearby, hands folded, eyes dark with knowing. "No one's forcing you," Rowan said, voice low. "We know what's at stake," Morrison answered. He tightened the straps on his pack, already smeared with dried blood and dust. His left arm was bound tight from an old sprain, and a bruise bloomed dark along his temple from the last ambush. "They're watching the main trail. They'll expect the man with the badge to run." Faith nodded. "So we give them what they want." Hope looked up at Rowan, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be the bait." Rowan didn't like it. Every part of him screamed against letting the girls walk toward danger, but Morrison was right. They had no clean path left. Only smart ones. "You get caught," Rowan said. They'll kill you." "They'll try," Morrison replied. Rowan looked at each of them, lingering on the twins. These weren't fragile girls anymore. They were scouts, fighters, symbols of a truth too big to stay hidden. And now, for the plan to work, they would have to act as a decoy while he carried the proof to Denver. He drew a small compass from his coat and pressed it into Hope's hand. "If I don't make it," he said, "you take this to the surveyor at Red Peak. He'll know what it means." Faith looked him dead in the eye. "You'll make it." They split just before dawn. Rowan headed north on foot, climbing fast toward the upper ridge trails. Morrison and the girls took the southern pass, sticking to the canyon floor where the shadows were thickest and the old traps had been laid days before. By midday, Rowan could already hear gunfire echoing through the ravine behind him. The trap had been sprung. He didn't stop. He pressed on through wind and shale, heart pounding, legs aching, the badge's hidden compartment pressed against his ribs like a second pulse. The trail to Red Peak would take him another day, but every hour counted now, every step further away from Blackwood's reach. But by dusk, something gnawed at his gut. The echoes behind him hadn't stopped. Back at the canyon, chaos erupted. Blackwood's men had come in numbers, 12 riders with long guns and a pack mule rigged with explosives. Morrison's decoy worked well enough to draw them in, but the cost was high. He was shot in the leg early on and forced to crawl into a gully while the twins scrambled for cover beneath the overhang. Faith dragged a mirror from her coat, aimed it toward the cliff face, and flicked it in a tight, practiced rhythm. Hope picked up a stone and lobbed it toward a fragile column of scree. It collapsed on cue, taking down the lead rider and one of the men beside him. The plan had always been to lead them into the V, a natural choke point where the path narrowed and was flanked by loose rock piles. Triggers had been set days before, small ropes, wedges, levers. Now the girls moved in tandem, triggering collapse after collapse. The horses screamed. Blackwood shouted orders, rage overtaking strategy. He advanced on foot, revolver drawn, eyes locked on the figures behind the rocks. He didn't notice the snare rope at his feet until it tightened. By then, Faith had rolled from behind a boulder and knocked the pistol from his hand. Hope emerged beside her, holding a second mirror. High above them, Elias, the Lakota tracker, caught the signal. He triggered the final rock slide. By the time Rowan circled back hours later, drawn by the rising smoke and silence, it was over. Blackwood sat tied to a tree, blood drying on his temple. His men were scattered or unconscious. Morrison leaned against a boulder, leg bandaged, eyes sharp despite the pain. The twins were eating jerky like it was just another day. Rowan crouched beside Morrison. "You all right?" "I'll live," the doctor grunted. "Thanks to them." Rowan turned to the girls. "You saved everyone." Faith shrugged. "He fell in the trap he built." Hope added, "We just gave him a push." Rowan nodded. It was enough. They made camp that night under the stars, quiet except for the wind. Elias kept watch on the canyon rim, rifle across his knees. Blackwood sat alone, guarded, muttering threats no one believed anymore. But the real blow came at dawn, when one of Blackwood's men, wounded and limping, tried to run. They caught him a mile out, and in desperation, he offered a deal. "I'll tell you something," he gasped, "something bigger than Blackwood." Rowan narrowed his eyes. "Start talking." The man swallowed. "Hartwell's not working alone. The marshal in Denver, Thomas, he's been approached, bribed, maybe worse. If he takes that evidence, you can't be sure it'll see the light." Rowan said nothing, but inside he felt the blood drain from his limbs, if even the marshal wasn't safe. Then they weren't near the end. They were just hitting the heart of the storm. Denver hit Rowan like a punch to the chest. After weeks of pine forests and dirt trails, the brick streets and gas lamps felt too loud, too fast, too clean. Horses shared the roads with carriages. Paper boys shouted headlines. Women in pressed dresses eyed him with mild suspicion as he passed. He didn't blame them. He looked like a man who'd just come out of the mountain. Mud-streaked coat, weeks of stubble, one eye always watching the rooftops. But he wasn't alone. Beside him, Faith and Hope walked in matching cloaks, their hands tucked into Dr. Morrison's. The girls were quiet, but not afraid. Their eyes scanned the city with sharp, unblinking focus. Rowan had the badge hidden beneath his shirt, the documents tucked into a hollowed Bible Morrison had used during the journey. Every step brought them closer to answers, or to betrayal. After what they'd learned about Marshall Thomas, they weren't taking chances. Instead, they headed for a small brick church near the edge of Capitol Hill. The sign out front read, "Reverend Grace Morrison, Sundays at 10, shelter always open." Rowan stopped short. "Your sister's a preacher." Morrison smiled faintly. She always had the backbone in the family. Inside, the sanctuary was quiet and warm, the wooden pews polished with care. A woman stood at the altar, her gray hair braided down her back, her eyes fierce and clear. She spotted Morrison limping through the doorway and dropped the prayer book in her hands. "Raymond." She moved fast for a woman in her 60s, wrapping him in a hug so hard he winced. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "Long story," he murmured. "And we don't have time." Rowan stepped forward, removing his hat. "Ma'am, we need your help." Grace nodded, already collecting herself. "Tell me everything." They did, behind the closed doors of her parlor. Rowan laid out the documents, the badge, the list of stolen lands and buried deaths. Morrison explained the shell companies, the fake deeds, the deaths swept under the rug. The girls added what they saw, what they heard, what they lived. Grace listened without flinching. When they were done, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled. "I know a man," she said. "Judge Whitmore. He's old, but honest, not part of the machine, and he owes me." Rowan raised an eyebrow. "I saved his daughter during a scarlet fever outbreak," she said with a shrug. "Sometimes being a woman of God has perks." The meeting took place in the judge's chambers after sundown. Whitmore was tall, thin, and sharp-eyed, with no patience for nonsense. He scanned the documents in silence for nearly an hour before speaking. "This is enough to indict Blackwood," he said. "And possibly Hartswell. The forged deeds are damning." Rowan leaned forward. "What about the marshal?" Whitmore's face tightened. "If he's been compromised, we'll handle that internally. But this goes public. Tomorrow, I'll issue orders to the territorial circuit. We'll reopen every disputed land case. No more sealed files. No more ghost signatures." Morrison looked like a man on the edge of sleep. He closed his eyes. Just for a second. Faith took his hand under the table. Rowan stared at the judge. "If you take this on, you'll be a target." Whitmore met his gaze without blinking. "I already am." The next morning, the headlines rolled off the presses in thick black ink. "Land fraud scandal, Rock Cedar Flats, sheriff arrested, more to come." By noon, the Hartwell Group's Denver office was boarded up. Several county clerks had been brought in for questioning. A U.S. district attorney confirmed new trials were being set for all contested property seizures. Rowan stood outside the courthouse as the crowd swirled. Reporters shouted questions. Former victims wept openly on the steps. It was chaos, but righteous chaos, the kind that sweeps clean. He felt the weight of the badge in his coat and the absence of the hills at his back. Grace stepped beside him, folding her hands. "You ever think about putting the badge back on?" she asked. "I had," Rowan said. "Once. Well, now the marshal's seat in Cedar Flats is open. The judge thinks you're the best man for it." Rowan didn't answer. You already protected more people than most lawmen ever will, she added gently. Behind them, Morrison sat with the girls on a bench, watching pigeons scavenge crumbs. Hope giggled as one bird jumped too close and startled Faith. For a moment, they looked like any family on a quiet morning. Rowan turned back to Grace. If I go back, I don't go back alone. You won't, she said. You never were. He looked out at the city, its spires and stone and sky, and tried to picture himself in a uniform again. Tried to imagine staying still long enough to build something that lasted. Then Faith stood up and waved to him, and for the first time in years, Rowan waved back. But somewhere in the crowd, a man in a fine grey suit watched them with a stillness that felt colder than the wind, and Rowan felt the prickling again at the back of his neck. Justice might be coming, but it was never easy, and it was never done. The land near Pine Hollow had always been wild. Elk tracks carved soft paths through the tall grass. Morning mist clung to the earth like breath from the mountains. For years, the hills had known only silence, until people came back with seeds in their pockets and hope stitched into every step. Rowan stood on the porch of a half-built cabin, hammer in one hand, coffee in the other. The frame was done. The roof, mostly. Inside, the bones of a stove waited to be lit. But what caught his eye wasn't the house. It was the small field behind it, where two girls raced through the rows of young corn, laughing like the world had never hurt them. "Uncle Rowan," Faith called, waving a wide-brimmed hat in the air. "Hope tripped," she added, between bursts of laughter. "I let her win," Hope shouted back. Rowan smiled and took a sip of his coffee. No sugar, just the way he liked it. The way Lucy had made it, back when mornings had meant something. Behind him, the new town was rising. Not a town in the legal sense. No charter, no saloon yet, no bank. Just a stretch of cabins, tilled earth, and the sound of hammering from dawn to dusk. The survivors of Cedar Flats, plus a few more who'd heard what was being built, had claimed the valley like it was holy ground. And in a way, it was. Morrison's clinic stood at the center, a whitewashed structure with a single sign carved in pine. Free care. No questions. Inside, Morrison worked from sunup, sewing wounds and treating fevers. He never charged a penny. The girls helped when they could, boiling instruments, fetching clean cloths, whispering jokes to patients with wide, frightened eyes. Rowan had offered to build a fence around the clinic. Morrison had just grunted and said, "Build a bench instead. People need rest more than walls." So Rowan did both. Each day passed like that. Hard work, simple food, and a slow stitching of the soul that no one talked about, but everyone felt. And then, one afternoon, a letter came. Rowan found it resting on the porch rail, tucked beneath a stone shaped like a heart. There was no return address, just his name in tight, elegant script. Inside, the handwriting was soft and careful, as if afraid to press too hard. "Dear Mr. McBride, you don't know me, but I knew your wife. Lucy taught me how to read, back when no one else cared to try. I was 13 and angry at the world. She sat with me anyway, every day after chores. Her voice was soft, but she never let me quit. When I heard your name in the papers, I knew it had to be you. She talked about you like you were made of oak and sunrise. I used to think that was just the way widows talk, but after everything you've done, maybe she was right. I thought you should know. Lucy kept a journal. She wrote in it every day, even in the last weeks. I have it now, and if you ever want to read it, it's yours. I live in what's left of Cedar Flats, the house with the crooked chimney. Come if you like. Or don't. Either way, I wanted to say thank you." Martha Glenn Rowan read the letter 3 times, then folded it neatly and placed it in his coat pocket. He didn't speak for a long while. Faith climbed up onto the porch rail beside him. "Bad news?" she asked. "No," Rowan said quietly. "Just news I didn't expect." Hope joined them, her cheeks flushed from the run. "We're planting beans tomorrow," she said. "You should come help." Rowan nodded. "I'll be there." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink into the hills. Somewhere nearby, a banjo started playing. Children's voices rose in song, off-key, messy, but full of life. It wasn't peace, but it was close. And for Rowan McBride, that was enough for now. Still, as the stars came out one by one, he kept thinking of the letter in his coat pocket and of a woman in a crooked roof house waiting with a journal full of Lucy's words. He wasn't sure if he was ready to open that door, but maybe, just maybe, he would. The soil in Pine Hollow was stubborn, thick with stone and slow to give, but when Rowan dug his hands into it that morning, something shifted inside him, something old and tight that finally let go. He knelt in front of the cabin with Faith and Hope, sleeves rolled up, a bag of rose clippings at their side. The girls argued over color. "Red means love," Faith insisted. Hope wrinkled her nose. "Pink's better, less dramatic." Rowan chuckled. "You plant both, you hedge your bets." They laughed, and the sound danced out into the fields where wheat was beginning to catch the morning light. Beyond the cabin rose, the new town bustled with spring energy. Fresh timber going up, goats bleating, someone shouting for help, fixing a jammed water pump. But here, in this small square of soil, time slowed. Each rose bush they planted had a name. One for Lucy, one for Jacob Morrison, one for every name on the Hartwell list who hadn't made it, and one more set right beside the porch, where Rowan placed the old corn-husk doll. Its fabric was sun-faded, the stitching rough, but it still held shape, still stood watch. Faith pressed the soil down around its base. "She needs a name," she said. "Maybe we don't name her," Rowan said softly. "Maybe she just remembers." Hope looked up. "Do you think people remember us when we're gone?" Rowan reached over and touched the top of her head. "If they don't, we'll plant something that does." Later that week, Grace Morrison returned from Denver with a photographer in tow. Not the fancy kind, just a traveling man with a folding box camera and a tripod wrapped in canvas. He'd been hired to document the rebirth of Cedar Flats and the settlements beyond. But when he saw the cabin with the rose bushes and the girls barefoot in the grass, he stopped. "You folks family?" he asked. Rowan opened his mouth, closed it. Then he looked at the girls. Hope had taken his hand without thinking. Faith was already standing straight like it was Sunday picture day. "We are," he said. The man snapped the photo. There first. No one smiled perfectly. Rowan's shirt was missing a button. The wind caught Faith's hair mid-shot. But the picture felt real. Honest. Like something that might last. That evening, a group of orphans arrived from a burned-out mining camp farther west. Morrison took 2 into the clinic. The rest found places with the settlers, 1 with the baker, 2 with the widow who ran the laundry. Rowan built a fire in front of the cabin and brought out a blanket. The kids gathered like they'd known him forever. One sat in his lap, another curled beside the old husk doll. He began with a quiet voice. "There was a girl once, wandered through the woods looking for food. She didn't say much, she didn't have to." And as the fire cracked and the stars wheeled above, Rowan told them the story. Not of danger or blood, but of how people found one another in a broken world. Of how hope wasn't loud, but stubborn. Like roots, like children. Faith leaned against his arm. Hope passed out with her head on his knee. By the time the flames died down, Rowan McBride knew he wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Rowan found a letter waiting on the porch again. Martha Glenn had written back. "I've thought about what Lucy would say if she could see you now. I think she'd tell you, keep going, keep opening doors." There's still more to do, more hearts to find. Come visit soon. I have a feeling your story isn't done." He read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it next to the photo in his chest pocket. Across the field, Morrison waved from the clinic porch. Children chased goats through the garden rows. A woman in a faded blue dress stood near the new schoolhouse, her eyes meeting Rowan's from across the dirt road. He nodded to her, just once. A start. Behind him the roses had begun to bloom, not all at once, but enough. Enough to believe something good had taken root. Enough to believe in another story someday. Enough to believe in second chances. If you've ever found love or family after you thought it was too late, share your story below. You're not alone. And neither is Rowan McBride. His journey's just beginning. Book 2, coming soon.